Stop acting like you're rich, Mom. That's what her son said, laughing, certain she'd never do more than dream. Margaret Lewis, widow and former accountant, didn't argue. She just signed the papers. By the time the headline hit, unknown buyer pays cash for $4.5 million to Chicago Penthouse. Her children were already knocking on her door, newspaper in hand and pride in pieces. She didn't buy the view to prove a point. She bought it to remind them who built the foundation. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Sunday dinners had become ritual more out of duty than affection. The smell of roast chicken and rosemary filled my small kitchen, but the warmth never quite reached the table. Ethan sat at the head as if he'd earned the right by age alone, scrolling through his phone between bites. Samantha poured herself another glass of Chardonnay, eyes flicking toward me each time I spoke, like she was measuring how long she had to pretend interest. I'd made the mistake of trying to share something light. "I stopped downtown after my appointment yesterday," I said, laying my napkin across my lap. "There's a new high-rise near the lake. I went up to see one of the penthouses just to look." The pause that followed was sharp enough to cut through the clatter of silverware. Ethan didn't even glance up at first, just let out a dry laugh. "Stop acting like you're rich, Mom. You're not one of those penthouse people." Samantha smiled tightly. "She probably just wants to feel fancy for a day. Don't we all?" Her tone was sugar over acid. My fork hung halfway to my mouth before I set it down. I didn't say a word. Didn't need to. The silence did more damage than any argument could. Tommy, bless him, looked between us, confused. "Grandma, did you like it?" I smiled for him. "Yes, sweetheart. It had a nice view." Ethan cleared his throat, suddenly interested in the peas on his plate. "Mom, you should be careful with those places. They'll sweet-talk you into things you can't afford." There it was. His favorite myth, that I was fragile and naive. I'd balanced corporate ledgers longer than he'd been alive, but he always managed to forget that. I nodded anyway. "You're right, dear. I'll keep that in mind." The conversation shifted to Tommy's soccer game, then to Samantha's coworker who finally bought something decent in Lakeview. I let them talk. My chicken cooled. Every word after that sounded like it came from underwater. When they left, I stood by the window and watched their SUV back down the driveway, taillights fading into the quiet suburban dark. I'd spent decades teaching myself to take comments like that as harmless, just pride talking. But tonight, it felt heavier, as if all those little dismissals had gathered in one place and found their voice. My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Grace. "Still thinking about the penthouse?" I stared at the screen, thumb hovering. Grace always seemed to sense when my composure cracked. "Yes," I typed back. And not just looking this time. A pause. Then her reply lit up the dark kitchen. "About time." I laughed softly. It surprised me. The sound felt new, unapologetic. I made tea, sat at the old oak table, and opened my laptop. The glow filled the small room, reflecting off the framed photo of David, my late husband. His quiet smile seemed to approve. After he died, I'd promised myself to live simply, to keep the house, to keep everything predictable. Predictable felt safe then. Tonight, it just felt small. I searched the listing again. The images looked even more impossible now. The floor-to-ceiling glass, the skyline spilling in like liquid gold at sunset. The agent's contact information was at the bottom. Alan Cooper, managing broker. I remembered his card. He'd handed it to me when I'd toured the property, polite but professional. "It's a breathtaking space," he'd said. I hadn't disagreed. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could almost hear Ethan's laugh again. "Stop acting like you're rich, Mom." He had no idea how rich I was, not in the way he counted it, but in what I'd saved, invested, built. Years of spreadsheets and quiet restraint of saying no when it would have been easy to show off. I clicked compose. "Alan, this is Margaret Lewis. I'd like to discuss the unit we toured yesterday. Confidentially, please." Before I could second-guess myself, I hit send. Outside, a train rumbled somewhere distant, the sound stretching across the night. The neighborhood was asleep, but my pulse was awake, steady, deliberate. I closed the laptop and looked again at David's picture. "You'd think I'm crazy," I whispered. "Or maybe you'd finally say it's about damn time." The clock ticked toward midnight. Tomorrow I'd make the call official. Tonight, I let the decision settle in my chest like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. Cold, clean, necessary. When I finally turned off the light, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not defiance, freedom. And somewhere beneath it, a quiet promise. They would never laugh at me that way again. Monday morning, sunlight cut through the blinds in narrow stripes, landing across my kitchen table. The same one where I'd signed checks, balanced budgets, and raised a family on discipline and quiet pride. The tea in my cup had gone cold by the time Alan Cooper's reply arrived. "Of course, Mrs. Lewis. I'll make the arrangements. Confidentiality guaranteed." I read it twice, then once more for courage. The decision I'd made in a flicker of defiance now felt startlingly solid. By early afternoon, I stood in the marble lobby of Cooper and Lang Realty, surrounded by glass, chrome, and the hum of money. Receptionists spoke in lowered tones, the kind reserved for clients who didn't need to prove themselves. I caught my reflection in a paneled wall. Neat blazer, hair pulled back. The kind of woman you'd overlook until she handed you a check that cleared too easily. Alan came out to greet me himself. Tall, composed, expensive suit, but an honest face. "Mrs. Lewis," he said warmly, shaking my hand. "I'm glad you reached out. Please, come in." His office overlooked the Chicago River, sunlight bouncing off the windows of neighboring towers. He gestured toward a leather chair, and as I sat, I noticed the small details. A framed family photo on his desk, the faint scent of cedar polish, the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen every kind of buyer walk through his door. He folded his hands. "You're interested in Unit 49C. The seller is eager. Are you still thinking all cash?" "All cash," I said. "Through the holding company we discussed." He nodded, professional but curious. "No publicity, I assume?" "None," I replied. "I want peace, not envy." He smiled at that, the kind of smile that said he understood more than he'd ever admit. Understood. Discretion is an art around here. While he went over the final figures, I let my gaze drift to the skyline beyond the glass. Cranes, rooftops, streaks of sunlight slicing between buildings. Chicago looked different from this height, as if the city's constant noise softened when you finally rose above it. Alan slid the folder across to me. "Here's the purchase agreement. Once you sign, we'll wire funds from your holding company to the escrow account." I uncapped my pen. The moment the tip touched paper, my pulse steadied. For all the years I'd spent being cautious, I'd never realized how liberating it felt to move without asking permission. Halfway through signing, my phone buzzed. A text from Grace. "Lunch later? Or are you too busy buying skyscrapers?" I smirked, typed back one word, maybe. When the last page was signed, Alan extended his hand again. Congratulations, Mrs. Lewis. You now own one of the most coveted views in Chicago. Let's keep that between us, I said. He nodded. Your secret's safe. Shall I arrange keys for tomorrow? Yes, I said, rising. Tomorrow feels right. Grace insisted on meeting me at our usual cafe afterward. The kind with chipped mugs and waitresses who called everyone Han. She was already at a corner table when I arrived, stirring cream into her coffee like it owed her something. Well, she said, squinting over her glasses, you're either glowing from good moisturizer, or you just did something very, very bold. I set the manila folder on the table between us. I signed. Her mouth fell open, then curved into a grin. You're about to become a ghost billionaire. I laughed softly. No, just a woman done apologizing for earning well. Grace reached over and squeezed my hand. Maggie Lewis, I've waited 20 years to see you stop shrinking yourself. I shrugged, but I couldn't hide the warmth creeping up my neck. I suppose there's a strange poetry to it, buying silence with the same money they used to ignore. She raised her mug in a toast. To peace, then. Sometimes, I said, clinking mine gently against hers. Silence is the loudest revenge. That night, back home, the house felt smaller than it ever had. I packed a single box, photos, a few books, the teapot David and I had bought in Boston long ago. The rest could wait. When I finally sat at the table again, the same one where Ethan's laughter had cut through me the night before, I felt an odd sense of calm. My son thought wealth was something loud, something flaunted. He'd never understand that the truest kind was quiet, the kind that didn't need witnesses. Outside, the sky over the suburbs was a dull gray wash, but I could almost picture my new view, lights shimmering across the lake, the city alive and endless. Tomorrow, I'd hold the keys. And as I turned off the lamp, a single thought settled like a whisper I could almost hear. They'll never see it coming. The first Sunday after closing, I woke to the hum of the refrigerator and sunlight streaming across boxes stacked like small promises. The keys to the penthouse sat in a neat pile on the counter beside my coffee cup, brushed steel, heavy, almost ceremonial. I hadn't told a soul yet, not even Grace, that I'd gone downtown the previous evening to stand in the empty apartment and breathe it in. It still smelled of paint and quiet beginnings. Now I was back in my old kitchen, apron tied, making eggs and scones as if nothing in the world had shifted. Ethan, Samantha, and Tommy were due for brunch. They were never late when food was involved. When the doorbell rang, I took a slow breath and answered it with a practiced smile. Ethan carried a bottle of wine, unopened, unnecessary, while Samantha swept in like she was entering a showroom. "Mom, you look nice," she said, eyes already scanning the kitchen. "Still keeping the same curtains, I see." "Still work fine," I said, setting plates on the table. "No sense fixing what isn't broken." Samantha laughed lightly. "You and your budget logic." Ethan dropped into a chair, scrolling through his phone as usual. "Traffic was a nightmare," he muttered. "Gas prices are ridiculous. Between that and the mortgage, I don't know how anyone's supposed to breathe." "You manage," I said softly. Samantha rolled her eyes. "Barely. We've been talking about refinancing again. I told Ethan we should just sell and rent something downtown for a change." She turned her attention to me, her smile perfectly shaped and perfectly false. "Of course city living's not for everyone. You could never handle that pace, Mom." I poured coffee, steady-handed. You'd be surprised what I can handle." For a moment, the only sound was the faint tick of the wall clock. Samantha glanced away, clearly unprepared for that answer. Tommy broke the silence. "Grandma, are you rich?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Samantha froze, mortified. "Tommy, that's not polite." But Ethan chuckled. "Kids got your curiosity, Mom. You tell us. Hiding any treasure under that mattress of yours?" They laughed. I didn't. I smiled instead, the kind of smile you wear when you know something they don't. "Rich?" I said, tilting my head. "Let's just say I'm comfortable enough not to worry." Tommy grinned, satisfied. Ethan reached for another scone, unaware that the woman sitting across from him could buy and sell his condo twice over and still have money left for dessert. The conversation drifted to summer plans. Samantha wanted to escape somewhere civilized. Ethan grumbled about bonuses that never arrived. I listened, nodding when required, thinking about the quiet marble floors waiting for me downtown, the way the city lights had spilled across them last night like spilled champagne. After they left, after the hugs, the casual dismissals, the faint scent of Samantha's perfume lingering like judgment. I stood in the doorway a long time. The silence that followed wasn't empty this time. It was full. Full of truth I no longer needed to explain. I locked up, changed into a navy dress, and took the train into the city. No chauffeur, no show. Just me and the sound of the tracks carrying me toward a different kind of air. When I unlocked the penthouse door, the sunlight nearly blinded me. The glass walls stretched wide, the skyline glittering like something alive. The space was still half empty. A few boxes, a folded blanket, a bottle of wine Grace had insisted I bring for the christening. I set my purse down on the marble counter and walked straight to the window. From this height, the city looked both vast and close enough to touch. My reflection floated over it, a faint overlay of who I used to be. I thought of Ethan's voice. "You could never handle city living, Mom." The corners of my mouth lifted. "You'd be surprised," I whispered. The room swallowed the words and gave them back softer, truer. For years, I'd lived in spaces built for comfort, not power. But this was different. This was air that didn't apologize. I pulled the balcony doors open and stepped out into the wind. It whipped through my hair, cold and electric, as if the city itself were greeting me. Cars crawled below, anonymous, distant. Somewhere among them, my family was driving home to their mortgage and their laughter, unaware that the skyline they admired belonged to me now. I gripped the railing, closed my eyes, and let the noise of the city rise around me. Not chaos, not pride, just life. Tomorrow, I'd furnish this place. But tonight, I'd stand here and memorize the feeling, freedom at altitude. And as the sun dipped behind the towers, painting the glass in gold, one thought came clear and steady, the kind that changes everything quietly. This is what they said I couldn't have. And now, it's mine. It wasn't until the next Sunday that the whisper started. I hadn't heard it, but Grace had. "Don't let them get to you," she said, setting down her wine glass like she was putting down a sword. We were sitting in a small, quiet bistro downtown, just the two of us. The only kind of place where you could slip into the dark corner booths and hide from the world if you needed to. Grace always knew how to find the edges of things, the places where people whispered but didn't quite dare to look. She'd heard it through some mutual acquaintances. "They're already talking, Maggie," she said. "Samantha told some of her friends that you're starting to lose touch with reality." I sat back in the booth, the smooth porcelain of my coffee cup feeling too light, too delicate. I smiled but didn't say anything at first. The idea that they were gossiping about me was almost comical, as if my life had suddenly become an unsolvable puzzle for them. Touch with reality? I said finally. I suppose they're right. I'm not living the way they expected me to. Grace raised her eyebrows but stayed quiet, waiting for me to say more. You know, I said, swirling the dark coffee in my cup. They might think I'm out of touch with their reality, but their reality isn't exactly mine, is it? Grace didn't answer right away. She took a slow sip of her wine, giving me time to feel the weight of the words settle. No, she finally said, but it's hard for them not to talk. You've suddenly become this enigma. I laughed, sharp and quiet. They'll just have to get used to it. Are you sure? Grace leaned in a little closer. Because sooner or later, they'll find out who the buyer really is. Your name's on tax records, Maggie. Not mine. I said it simply, with no hesitation. It's the company's. Grace paused, eyes narrowing with that familiar knowing. You've thought of everything, haven't you? I shrugged, setting the coffee down. The company's been around for years. There's no reason for them to dig deeper. But even if they do, let them. There's nothing wrong with making smart decisions with what you have. Grace nodded, but her smile was still a little uneasy. And when they realize what's really happened, let them realize. I leaned back, the confidence in my words not a mask, but a quiet truth I was learning to wear. It'll be a shock for a while, sure, but in time they'll see this as just another one of my decisions, like all the others I've made quietly. She sighed, a laugh escaping her lips. You've become quite the expert at not making noise. I smiled, my mind already shifting to the apartment. I hadn't mentioned to anyone yet how I'd spent the past week filling it with pieces of my life. Not the luxury brands or grandiose furniture they might expect. Just things that had been left behind in my old life. Photographs of David, the faded picture frames, the teapot we'd bought together when we'd first moved to the suburbs, the books that had lived on our shelves for decades. By the time I was alone again, I stood in the doorway of the penthouse, letting my eyes sweep across the space I had so carefully curated. The walls had taken on a warmth I hadn't expected. The pieces that filled the room now. A dining table from a secondhand shop I'd visited. The leather armchairs that had been David's favorites. All of them felt like memories being given new life. I walked over to the bookshelf and ran my fingers along the spines of the old books. Some had faded bindings, some cracked covers, but they were mine. All the choices I had made before, quietly building a life of security, of patience, of care. Alan had come by a few days earlier to help me place the final touches. He'd stood at the door, his hands in his pockets, a quiet smile on his face. Feels like home already, he'd said, his eyes drifting over the space. I hadn't answered right away. Instead, I'd moved toward the window. The skyline stretched out before me like an endless promise. It feels like mine again, I finally said, my voice soft but firm, like I was putting my flag in the ground for the first time. Alan had nodded, the words falling away between us as the city continued its breathless dance outside. He'd left soon after, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the space that was now truly mine. The silence in the apartment wrapped around me like a blanket. There was no one else here. No expectations. No judgment. Just the city, the memories, and the peaceful realization that I had become something else entirely. Something beyond the narrow view they had held of me. I smiled to myself, a thought stirring in the quiet of the room. They think they know me, but they've only scratched the surface. The morning was quiet when the doorbell rang. I had just finished my second cup of tea, the soft hum of the house the only sound. The sun streamed through the kitchen window, a perfect autumn glow that made the air feel heavier than usual. But it wasn't the air that had shifted. It was the weight of the world. I wasn't expecting anyone. Not yet, anyway. I hadn't told anyone about the penthouse, and I sure as hell hadn't told Ethan or Samantha. Not in any clear way, anyway. It wasn't necessary. They'd figure it out when they figured it out, and that's exactly how I wanted it. But when I opened the door, it wasn't a neighbor or even Grace. It was Ethan, practically bursting through the threshold with a newspaper clutched in his hands like it was some kind of weapon. His face was flushed, eyes wide, the kind of look a person gets when they've just been hit with something they can't quite process. He didn't even wait for me to say anything before thrusting the paper in my face. "Mom, what the hell is this?" His voice was sharp, higher than usual, almost frantic. The front page of the Chicago Tribune was wide open between us, the headline in bold, glaring at me like a beacon. Record cash purchase, unknown buyer acquires 4.5 Chicago Penthouse. I took a moment to scan the article, the words swimming in front of me. The article itself wasn't much, a quick blurb about the mysterious buyer and the apartment's price tag, but the details didn't matter. What mattered was the name. The LLC's name. ML Properties. My initials, right there in black and white. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or to grit my teeth. "Is that you?" Samantha's voice sliced through the silence behind him. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her face a mask of disbelief. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I stared at the headline, allowing the weight of it to settle over me. The secret's out. The reality of it washed over me in waves, but I didn't feel panic, just a quiet sense of inevitability. Ethan shoved the paper at me again. "That's you, isn't it? How long were you going to keep this from us, huh?" I straightened up, my expression neutral. The truth was there, but I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. "You said I wasn't rich," I said softly, my voice calm. "I prefer to call it prepared." Ethan's face flushed deeper, his jaw tightening as he glared at me. "You lied to us, Mom. All this time, you've been lying to us. Why didn't you just say something?" I felt the tension rising in my chest, but I didn't let it show. "I didn't lie to you, Ethan. I just didn't volunteer information you didn't ask for." Samantha stepped forward, her eyes narrowed. "This isn't about asking, Mom. This is about trust. You've kept this from us for months. We had no idea you had this kind of money." Her voice cracked, like she was realizing something too heavy to bear. "What else are you hiding?" I shook my head, feeling that familiar weight in my chest, but not for the reasons they thought. I didn't feel guilt. I felt the burden of all the years I had spent shrinking myself for them. "No, Samantha," I said, my voice even but firm. "I didn't hide anything. I just didn't show it to you." Ethan slammed the newspaper down on the counter. "You should have told us. You owe us that much." His words were thick with anger, and there was something else there too. Hurt. "You think I owe you?" I replied, my voice low. "I've been the one carrying this family for years, without so much as a thank you. Every time you wanted something, every time you needed something, I gave. And when I didn't, you complained. You never asked how I did it, or why I did it. You just assumed that I'd keep doing it forever." Ethan stood frozen for a moment, his eyes locked on mine. He wanted to say more, I could tell, but the words weren't coming. They never did when he didn't have the moral high ground. Instead, he turned away, muttering under his breath, "This isn't fair, Mom." Samantha didn't say anything. She just stared at me, the same coldness creeping into her eyes that I'd seen so many times before. But this time, I didn't flinch. I walked over to the window, looking out over the street as if I could still see the skyline beyond. The city seemed so distant now, so far removed from the home I had once known. The wind outside rustled the leaves of the tree in the yard, carrying with it the faintest taste of freedom. I turned back to them, steady, calm. "I didn't lie to you. I just didn't apologize for what I've earned. You never asked, so I didn't tell you." A long silence followed, as the truth settled between us like an elephant in the room. Ethan looked ready to say something else, but his voice faltered. Samantha's eyes flickered between us, and then, slowly, she turned and walked out the door, leaving Ethan standing there, clutching that damn newspaper. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet of the house settle in around me. But even as the silence wrapped around me like a familiar cloak, I could feel the shift inside me, the unspoken realization that nothing would ever be the same again. And the strangest thing, I wasn't afraid of it. Not anymore. The silence in the house that afternoon felt like a deep bruise. It wasn't until the evening that they came back, Ethan and Samantha. They arrived separately, but their presence in the doorway felt like the storm after a long drought. The energy shifted immediately, the space between us thick with things unspoken and emotions unprocessed. Samantha didn't waste time. "You've been hoarding money all these years, haven't you?" Her words were a whip, sharp and unforgiving. Her eyes flickered over the house, as if searching for something to condemn. "All this time we were struggling, and you just kept it all for yourself." I stood in the kitchen, silent for a moment, the weight of her accusation sinking into my chest. My fingers rested on the countertop, steadying myself before I turned to face her. "You never asked for help," I said, my voice calm but with a hard edge. "You asked for control." Ethan, standing at the door, clenched his jaw. The look on his face wasn't anger anymore, but something deeper. Resentment? Maybe. Or hurt. His eyes shifted from Samantha to me, but there was no words. Only the weight of his disappointment. Samantha crossed her arms, her face twisted in disbelief. "You're just going to act like this is no big deal," she shot back. "You knew we were struggling. You could have helped us." I shook my head. "I've helped you for years, Samantha, and every time I did, you pushed me away." "Help?" Ethan's voice cracked. "You never told us. You never told any of us what you had, what you could do. You've kept us in the dark." His hands were balled into fists at his sides. "You should have told us." I took a step closer, my eyes locking on his. "You never asked, Ethan. You never asked me how I managed, how I built my life, how I made every choice, every penny count. You assumed I couldn't handle it. You assumed it was a secret because I was ashamed." I paused, feeling the weight of every year, every frustration, every silence. "I wasn't ashamed, Ethan. I was waiting for you to ask." The words hit hard, hanging in the air between us like a palpable force. Ethan didn't move. He just stared at me. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the way his pride had shattered like glass. Samantha looked away, as if she couldn't face the truth any longer. Finally, Ethan turned on his heel and walked out the door. No words. Just the sound of the door slamming behind him. Samantha stood frozen for a long moment before she shook her head and followed him. But before she left, she stopped, her gaze catching on me once more. I don't know what's happened to you, Mom. I don't know who you are anymore. Her words were harsh, but they held more fear than anything else. She turned on her heel, and the door clicked shut behind her. It was only then, when the house had emptied of all their judgment, that I felt it, the weight lifting from my chest. They were gone, and the silence was deafening in its finality. I walked to the window, looking out at the empty street. The neighborhood seemed unchanged, but everything felt different. The house had never felt more like a cage than it did now. I thought about the penthouse, the city lights, the expansive views, the room I'd filled with old pieces of my life. I moved into the penthouse the next morning, carrying only a few bags and a single suitcase. It was quiet, but in a different way. It wasn't the silence of the past, the quiet that weighed on me. No, this was a quiet full of possibilities, of new beginnings. The space was still sparsely furnished, a few pieces from the old house scattered around, but it felt like home already. That night, I stood at the window, my hands resting on the cool glass, the skyline sprawled out before me. The city lights shimmered, like 1,000 tiny stars scattered across the black sky. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't just seeing the city. I was part of it. I was here, in the thick of it all, where I had always belonged, but had never allowed myself to be. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't peaceful. Not in the way I'd imagined. I felt a small tremor in my hands, the first time I'd been truly alone in years. But even as I trembled, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A deep, aching relief. I was free. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet of the apartment settle over me. The floor beneath me felt solid, the weight of it grounding me in a way nothing had in a long time. I was finally alone, and there was power in that. There was peace, too. It wasn't the peace I thought I wanted, the quiet submission of a life lived without challenge. It was a different kind of peace. A peace built on strength. The phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the silence. A text from Grace. "How are you, Maggie? You good?" I smiled, setting the phone down. The answer was simple, but it felt so real now, without any pretense. I'm free. And as I stood there in the quiet, with the city sprawling out before me, I knew something they didn't. Something I hadn't known myself just a week ago. I was done apologizing. Mornings in the penthouse were different. The light, for one, came through the windows with a confidence I hadn't noticed before. The skyline spread before me like a canvas, the soft yellow hues of dawn blending into the cool blue of the city as the streets below began their daily crawl. I had coffee in hand, standing at the window, my reflection blending with the view, like I was part of it now. The apartment still had an emptiness to it, despite the small changes I'd made. A few antique rugs, some family pictures now placed in every room. It wasn't luxury for the sake of it. It was a life built on moments, not things. But even in its simplicity, this was my space. I'd paid for it, earned it, and now I could exist here, without apology. The phone buzzed from the counter, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a message from Samantha. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. "Mom, we could use your advice on budgeting. Things are tight around here. Can we talk?" For a moment, I just stared at the message. How quickly things changed. Just days ago, she was accusing me of hoarding. Now, she wanted advice on how to make ends meet. I could almost hear her voice in the words. The politeness wasn't lost on me. The sudden change, the way she'd gone from confrontation to seeking help, felt almost orchestrated. I tapped out a reply, keeping it simple, keeping it grounded. You once told me to stop acting rich. I took that to heart. The satisfaction of that line felt like the last weight lifting off my shoulders. There was no bitterness in me anymore. Just the realization that the power dynamics had shifted, and the change was not one I had caused. It was just how things were now. Later that week, Alan invited me to an art gala at one of the most exclusive galleries in the city. His voice on the phone was warm, but his tone had that edge of excitement I'd learned to recognize. "You've got the perfect taste for this," he'd said. "It's the kind of event where you'll make a real impact." And for the first time in ages, I agreed without hesitation. I didn't need to think it through. This wasn't about fitting in or about keeping up. This was about embracing the life I had earned. The gala was held in a sleek, modern building downtown, full of people dressed in extravagant black tie attire, with the hum of conversation punctuated by the clink of champagne flutes. I felt the eyes on me as I walked in. Not judgment, but curiosity. A sense of recognition I hadn't quite felt before. There was a shift in the air around me, as if the world had acknowledged my presence, but I wasn't the one doing the chasing anymore. I found Alan near a sculpture that seemed to glow under the soft lights. His smile widened when he saw me. "Maggie, you look stunning." I let him guide me through the crowd, chatting about artists and upcoming exhibits, but my mind wandered. It wasn't until I turned a corner, near a quiet alcove, that I saw her. Karen Holt, the investigative journalist who had written the piece about the penthouse purchase. She was standing by a canvas, engrossed in conversation with another guest. But when she noticed me, her eyes lit up. She excused herself from the group and walked over to me, extending her hand. "I have to tell you," she began, her voice warm but measured. "Your story really inspired me." She paused for a beat, her gaze steady. "A self-made woman buying her dream. That's rare, you know?" I shook her hand, surprised by the sincerity in her tone. I never thought of it that way. It wasn't about being self-made, though. It was about finally living the way I had always meant to. Karen nodded, clearly fascinated by the subtlety of the distinction. "I don't know if people really understand what it takes to get to this point. Most think it's about the penthouse, the brands, the surface stuff. But you're showing that there's a story beneath that." I smiled, the weight of her words sitting differently with me. The truth wasn't about the building or the price tag. It was about the years of small decisions that led me here. The quiet ways I had learned to navigate the world without needing to shout about it. She seemed to sense the shift in me. "I'd love to talk to you more about it, if you're open to it," she said, her eyes locking on mine. "Not for the paper, just to understand." I thought about it for a moment. This was the kind of attention I had once avoided, but now it felt right, grounded in something I could actually speak to. "I'd be happy to," I said, feeling the shift in the air between us. "Just not today. Maybe later." The night stretched on, but I felt the pull of something I hadn't in years, a deep sense of belonging, a quiet peace. I had learned so much over the past few days, months even. I had learned that people didn't see the power you held until you stopped hiding it. They didn't respect you until you stopped apologizing for your choices. I was no longer trying to fit into someone else's version of success. This was my success, my story, and no one else's opinion could rewrite it. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing in front of a floor-to-ceiling window, gazing at the city below. The skyline glittered like a living thing, and I felt a smile curve across my face. This was the life I had built, piece by piece. It had taken years, yes, but it was mine. Finally. I didn't expect him to show up. Not this soon. But Ethan, always the one to act out of some warped sense of duty, was standing at my front door the next Saturday morning. His knuckles barely made a sound as they tapped, but it felt like a declaration, a soft but insistent demand for attention. I had just finished a call with Grace, and the coffee I'd been savoring now sat, half drunk, beside me on the kitchen counter. Ethan stood there, hands stuffed into his pockets, a mask of reluctance on his face. "I thought I'd check on you," he said, his voice tight. It wasn't an invitation, it was an excuse. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. I didn't offer him coffee or the usual pleasantries. I simply nodded, stepping aside so he could come in. There was no need for conversation, no need for his explanation. His presence was already a heavy thing, shifting the air around me, filling the room with things unsaid. "So this is how the other half lives, huh?" His muttered words cut through the stillness as he looked around the open-plan space. The windows let in a flood of light, the city stretching out before us like an endless sea of possibility. I couldn't suppress a cool smile. "No, Ethan. This is how the disciplined half retires." He looked away, his gaze lingering on the expansive view. I could see the turmoil in his eyes, the confusion, the anger, the helplessness. He had spent so many years judging, assuming, and now, none of it made sense. None of it fit into the story he had written in his mind about who I was, who we were as a family. I didn't offer him a tour. He had no interest in seeing what the apartment truly meant to me. But as I moved past him, I gestured to the dining room, the sitting area. I could feel him follow, but I didn't look back. I didn't need to. There was a part of me that had already separated from him, emotionally. It had been years of giving, of bending to accommodate everyone else's expectations, their needs, their wants. And for what? To be mocked? To be accused of not helping when I'd already been giving more than they had ever truly asked for? "You've done well for yourself, Mom." The words were more bitter than he intended. I never thought this is where we'd end up. I stood at the window looking out at the city, not responding right away. There was nothing more to say, no more wounds I was willing to open for him to dig into. He was right about one thing. We had reached a point I hadn't imagined, but it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something I hadn't expected either. When I finally turned to face him, the distance between us was more than just physical. "Ethan," I said, my voice firm but without malice, "you never asked how I managed. You assumed I couldn't handle it, and now that I've shown you how well I can handle things, you're angry." He bristled, but I could see the shift in his expression. He was looking at me now, not as his mother, not as someone to manipulate, but as a stranger, a woman who had become unrecognizable to him. "Yeah, well," he muttered, stuffing his hands deeper into his jacket pockets. "You're still my mother." "That's not going to change." I didn't flinch. I didn't feel a rush of affection or guilt. Instead, I gave him a level look, one that finally met his eyes without hesitation. "Families don't mock," I said, my voice steady. "They root for each other. They don't tear each other down because they're too proud to ask for help." His face contorted as if he had more to say, but the words didn't come. His shoulders slumped in defeat, the weight of everything hanging in the space between us. "I don't know what you want from me anymore, Mom," he said, his voice softer now, vulnerable. I wasn't sure if I felt sympathy or resignation. all I knew was that whatever he was searching for, I couldn't give it to him anymore. I had given him everything: advice, care, money, but it was never enough. And now, in this space, in this life I had created, I had nothing left to offer but the truth. "I'm not who you think I am," I said quietly. "And I'm not the person I used to be. I've outgrown that version of me, but you'll have to figure out who I am now on your own." Without another word, I turned and walked toward the door. It was almost painful how simple it felt, how natural it was to end it with nothing but the sound of the door clicking shut behind him. I hadn't expected anything else, and I wasn't disappointed. The silence that followed felt like a breath held too long, finally released into the open air. I moved back to the window, looking out at the sprawling city before me. The night had begun to fall, and the skyline was dotted with millions of lights, some twinkling, some steady, all of them existing in their own world. For a brief moment, I felt the weight of all the choices I had made and how they had finally led me to this place. And just like that, I realized I was done trying to be everything for everyone else. The city was mine now. It always had been. The call from Grace came on a Wednesday while I was still unpacking the last of my boxes. The apartment was beginning to feel more like home, the walls decorated with memories, not just furniture. "I've got something you need to know," she said, her voice sharp with a kind of urgency I hadn't heard before. "Ethan and Samantha, they're drowning in debt." I paused, the sound of my heartbeat loud in my ears. "What do you mean?" "I'm talking second mortgage, unpaid taxes, the kind of debt that could swallow them whole. It's bad, Maggie." She took a breath, letting the weight of the news settle. "They've been hiding it from you, but they can't hide it forever." I walked to the window, looking out at the city below, but everything felt distant now. Ethan, Samantha, the anger, the accusations, all of it. I hadn't known they were in such a mess. "I don't know what you're going to do with this information," Grace continued, "but they need help, and they're too proud to ask." I didn't answer right away. I let the news sink in. There was a part of me, the part that had always been the protector, that wanted to step in, to fix things, to make it better for them. But there was another part, one that was tired of being the safety net, tired of always having to pick up the pieces. Finally, I spoke. "I'll take care of it." The next day, I went to see Ethan. He wasn't expecting me. He was never expecting me, and that made the whole thing easier somehow. He answered the door with a kind of wariness that had become familiar between us, but there was something different in his eyes, a nervousness, almost like he knew what I was about to say. "Can we talk?" I asked, stepping inside before he could answer. He sighed, rubbing his temple. "I don't know what you think you can fix, Mom, but whatever it is, it's too late." "I know about the debt," I said quietly, my voice steady but edged with something sharper. His face tightened, his jaw clenching as he stepped back, as if he were preparing for something worse. "How did you—" "I have my ways," I interrupted, my eyes locking on his. "You told me I couldn't handle money, Ethan. Yet, here you are, drowning in it." His eyes flinched at my words, the weight of them sinking into him. For a moment, he didn't speak. His hands trembled just slightly, clenched tightly in his pockets. "You've always been better at pretending than I gave you credit for," I continued, moving closer. "But this is bigger than you can fix with pride or anger. It's about responsibility. It's about worth." The words hit harder than I expected. The silence between us stretched until it felt suffocating, his shoulders slumping as the fight drained from him. I didn't want you to find out, he said, his voice raw, almost broken. I didn't want you to think we were failures, or that we couldn't handle it on our own. I studied him quietly. This was not the man who had stormed into my life with accusations and demands. This was a man cornered by his own choices, humbled by the very arrogance that had fueled him for so long. You never wanted help, Ethan, I said softly. But you've been drowning in it. You think it's about money? It's not. It's about worth. You never valued yourself enough to ask for it, let alone accept it. I saw the shame cross his face, and for a moment, he looked years younger, like the boy I had raised, the boy who never knew how to say, "I'm sorry," but always hoped that love would fix everything. I can help, I said, my voice steady. But I'm not going to do it in a way that leaves you thinking you're entitled to it. You'll never learn if I just give you a handout. I paused, letting him take it in. I've paid off your tax lien. It's done. He stared at me, wide-eyed, disbelieving. You... Don't thank me, Ethan, I interrupted. Just do better. Don't let your pride cost you everything. I left shortly after, the air between us still thick with unspoken things. As I walked to the elevator, I felt the weight of the moment. Part of me wanted to feel victorious, but all I could feel was an emptiness, like I had lost something I couldn't replace. I had given them the chance to reset, to rebuild, but they had to take it. That night, Grace called again, her voice laced with surprise. You actually did it? You paid off their debt? I sat in the quiet of the penthouse, looking out at the city once again. I did. But I'm not saving them, Grace. I'm giving them a chance. Still saving them, she teased, but there was something lighter in her voice. You can't help it, can you? I smiled, but it felt different this time. I can afford Grace, I said, letting the words hang in the air between us. It was only a few days after I'd paid off their tax lien that the first hint of something had shifted. Ethan wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't anything, really. Just quiet. Too quiet. He wouldn't meet my eyes when we passed each other in the hallway, or when I happened to be sitting by the window. It was as though something heavy had fallen between us that neither of us could lift. I hadn't seen Samantha since the confrontation. There had been no text, no call, no apology, just silence. But Ethan? He came by one morning, long before the coffee had finished brewing, standing at my door with an unreadable look on his face. Mom, he said, his voice flat. I found out. About what? I didn't look at him. Didn't need to. I could feel the weight of the conversation pressing in, and I wasn't in a rush to let it start. About the lien, he said, stepping inside without invitation. It's gone. The debt. All of it. We don't owe anything anymore. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the air settle between us before responding. You think I did it, don't you? I said, turning to face him, my voice level but firm. You think I erased your debt just to hold it over your head? He swallowed hard. I don't know what to think. There was a pause, thick with uncertainty. Did you do it? I didn't answer right away. I wanted to, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. He wasn't asking because he wanted to know the truth. He was asking because it was easier to blame me than to admit his own failure. So I simply looked at him, steady, unflinching. I'm not answering that, Ethan. I think you know the answer. His jaw tightened. I can't believe you do this to us. You don't get it, I said, my voice hardening. I didn't do it to you. I did it for you. There's a difference. I'm not your project, he spat, his anger bubbling up again. You've always been my project, Ethan. You just didn't see it that way. I walked past him, my gaze briefly drifting out the window. And this isn't about money, it's about dignity. It's about your worth. You've been living in the shadow of your own arrogance for so long. I'm not sure you even know who you are anymore. I let the silence hang heavy in the room, the truth sinking in for both of us. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice softer. Samantha says you're manipulating us, that you're making us feel small so we'll need you. I turned back to face him, not surprised by her words. Samantha says a lot of things. But you're wrong, Ethan. I'm not making you feel anything. You're doing that on your own. He didn't have a reply. He stood there for a while, the weight of his thoughts apparent, but I could see the flicker of something else in his eyes. A subtle shift, a realization that he hadn't expected. He had thought this was all about money, about control, about power. But it wasn't. It was about something he'd never learned how to deal with: humility. A few days passed, and I learned from Alan that the story about the penthouse had taken on a life of its own. It had gone viral. The headline read like something out of a fairy tale. Anonymous retiree buys 4.5 Million Chicago Penthouse in cash. Alan had been laughing when he called, amused by the media frenzy surrounding the mystery woman behind the purchase. My inbox was suddenly flooded with requests. News outlets, magazine editors, even podcasters wanted to interview me, to ask about my journey, the story of the woman who bought her dream home without blinking an eye. I refused every single one. When Alan asked why, I simply said, "Let mystery do the teaching." I wasn't interested in making a spectacle of my life. I wasn't interested in exploiting my choices for the world's approval. The peace I had found was quieter than that. It was personal. It was mine. A week later, I received another text from Grace, asking if I had seen the article in the Times. I hadn't, but the tone of her message made me curious. "Maggie," she had written, "it's everywhere. You're everywhere." I didn't respond, but I took a moment to sit back, to let the weight of it all settle. The world, it seemed, had already decided who I was, the woman who had quietly bought her freedom. But the truth was more complicated than that. The world didn't know the years of quiet decisions I'd made, the sacrifices I'd endured, or the weight of the loneliness I had carried. I walked over to the window, the city spread out before me, the skyline now feeling like an old friend. The lights twinkled below, the streets pulsing with life. There was something about it that seemed to reflect the truth I had finally embraced. I didn't need to be seen. I didn't need anyone to understand. I had built this life. It was mine, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me. Samantha's dinner invitation came like clockwork, with all the subtlety of a hammer strike. She had decided apparently that the time had come to bury the hatchet, at least for show. "We're having a small gathering," she had written in her text. "Just family and a few close friends. I want you to come. Tommy misses you." Tommy. The reason I couldn't refuse. The one person in this family who hadn't tried to tear me down or turn my quiet strength into a weapon. I showed up, dressed in a simple dress that hadn't been carefully chosen to impress anyone but me. Samantha greeted me at the door with that too wide smile, the one that had become so familiar. But this time it had an edge to it. Her fingers curled around my arm, her grip just a little too tight. "You look lovely," she said, though her eyes skimmed over me as if looking for something to criticize. "We're so proud of your success, Mom." I felt the words before I heard them. Proud. She hadn't said that in years. Not when she'd mocked me for my frugality or rolled her eyes at my simple tastes. But now, with all the right people in the room, she was suddenly proud. The guests were already mingling in the living room. They were familiar, friends of Samantha's, people from their world, the kind who spoke in glances and raised eyebrows. Their eyes moved over me like I was an exhibit, their praise suffocating. "Margaret, darling, we heard about your penthouse," one of Samantha's friends said, the words wrapped in a sugar-thin veneer. "What a bold move. How does it feel to finally treat yourself?" I smiled, but it wasn't a real smile. "It feels like home," I said coolly. I could feel their attention on me, like a spotlight I hadn't asked for, and it made the walls close in just a little. But Tommy, bless him, came rushing over, pulling my attention away with a tight hug. "Grandma, I'm glad you came," he said, looking up at me with that same untainted warmth that had been my solace for years. He had no agenda, no mockery, just love. Samantha watched, her expression softening as she saw Tommy's affection, but the shift in her was too late. She had tried for so long to change the narrative of who I was, but Tommy was the truth she couldn't fake. Dinner was served with all the grandeur Samantha could muster. Silver plates, carefully placed glasses, all the theatrics of a woman trying to rewrite the past. But as I took my seat, I could feel the eyes still on me, heavy and scrutinizing, as if I were the guest of honor in a ceremony I hadn't asked to be part of. "Mom," Samantha said, raising her glass in what could have been an apology, but wasn't. "We're so happy for you. You've truly earned everything you've got." I looked around the table at the guests who suddenly saw me as someone they could learn from, as if the penthouse, had somehow made me more than the person I had always been. I didn't feel celebrated. I felt suffocated. "Authenticity suits better than diamonds, dear," I whispered, loud enough for Samantha to hear, my words cutting through the noise. She flinched, her fingers tightening around her glass. The smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, but it was there. I could see the crack in the armor. Ethan was seated across from me, silent as usual, but there was a quiet shift in him. The arrogance had dimmed, replaced by something that looked more like quiet understanding. His eyes met mine, and he gave a small nod, a reluctant, unspoken thank you. I almost wanted to ignore it, to turn away, but I didn't. Instead, I lifted my glass and offered a small, genuine smile in return. Grace, who had been watching from the far end of the table, leaned in slightly, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "They'll learn, one public dinner at a time." I nodded without looking at her, focusing instead on the room that felt more like a theater now, a place where everyone wore their roles too tightly. I didn't need to play my part in their script anymore. I had my own story to tell, one that didn't include their approval. "Lessons already written in print," I said, the words settling in the air between us. It was a quiet declaration. The world didn't need to know the whole story. It would piece it together when it was ready. But for now, all I had to do was live it, with or without their understanding. Dinner continued, the noise filling the space like a tide I didn't want to wade through. The small talk, the false smiles, the compliments that felt like obligations instead of celebrations. But I didn't mind. I'd done my part. I'd survived their scrutiny. I'd survived their judgments. As the evening wound down and the guests started to leave, I watched Samantha hug her friends goodbye, her smile still pasted on. And though I had nothing left to say to her, I finally understood something. The world she had built for herself one of image and performance, had its limits. And I had built something much more lasting, something more real than any dinner party, any show of affection, any forced gesture. I had built my peace, my quiet, unapologetic life. It would take time, but in the end, they would all see the truth. I didn't need to be anyone's ideal. I was already enough. It started with a cold that lingered for days, a tightness in my chest that wouldn't loosen, a fever that hovered, stubborn. I told myself it would pass, that it was nothing, just the after effects of too much stress and too little sleep. But days turned into weeks, and still I felt a kind of exhaustion that didn't have a name. The penthouse, which had once felt like my sanctuary, now felt like a distant place. The view of the city outside remained constant, but everything inside me seemed to have slowed, as though the pulse of the city had moved on without me. Grace was the first to notice. She showed up one morning, unannounced, with a bag of homemade soup and a knowing look. "You're not fooling anyone, Maggie," she said, setting the food down on the kitchen counter. "I'm fine," I tried to say, but the words didn't ring true even to me. The weakness in my body was louder than any deflection I could offer. Alan came by later, bringing books and his usual dry humor. He didn't ask questions, but simply sat with me, as though his presence alone was the remedy I needed. I didn't have the energy to pretend anymore, not with them, not with anyone. When Ethan came, it was quieter. There was no announcement, no fuss. Just a knock at the door that pulled me out of a hazy sleep one afternoon. I opened it, half expecting to see Grace or Alan, but it was Ethan. His expression was different, hesitant, like he wasn't sure what he was walking into. "I brought you some tea," he said softly, holding up a thermos as if it were an offering. I didn't invite him in immediately. I was still too used to the walls I had built between us, to the space I had created that didn't include him. But this time, I stepped aside, letting him in without a word. He set the tea down on the coffee table, glancing around the room, his gaze falling on the empty spaces where furniture had yet to be placed. "You're not as fine as you think you are," he said, his voice low but caring. It wasn't the usual accusation, the usual distance. There was a softness there that caught me off guard. I sank back onto the couch, my body betraying me as I leaned into the cushions. "I don't need anyone to fix me, Ethan." He sat across from me, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't oppressive. It was new. It was real. Finally, after what felt like a small eternity, he spoke again. "I never realized how hard you worked to look effortless." The words were slow, as if he were trying to process them himself. "I always thought you just had it. Everything. Like it came easy to you." The admission struck me. Ethan had spent so many years seeing me through the lens of his own assumptions. To him, my life had always been a mystery, one he was never able to solve, not until now. I looked at him for a long moment, the weight of the years between us suddenly feeling less like a chasm and more like a shared history. "Wealth without humility," I said quietly, "is debt in disguise." He didn't respond right away. His eyes searched mine, and for the first time in a long time, he seemed to be seeing me as I truly was, not as his mother or as the woman who had always quietly carried everything, but as a person who had lived through her own struggles, her own sacrifices. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rougher now, like something in him had cracked open. "I never saw it. I never understood." There was a long pause. He didn't look like the man who had stormed into my life with accusations. He looked like someone who had been through his own reckoning, who had realized too late that the world he had built for himself was fragile. "Don't apologize," I said softly, the weight of the moment pressing on my chest. "You don't owe me anything, Ethan. Not anymore. You never asked, but I'm not holding it against you." He exhaled, the tension leaving his body in a way that felt almost like relief. I was still waiting for Samantha. She had stayed away, too proud to admit anything, too afraid of what facing the truth might mean. But I knew it wasn't my job to fix her. Ethan's visit felt like the beginning of something, but I didn't know what. Maybe it was forgiveness. Maybe it was just understanding. But I wasn't afraid of it anymore. Not the silence, not the space between us. For the first time, I felt the freedom to let go of the need to fix them, to just be. "I think I've been trying to fix everything for so long," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "But maybe it's time to start fixing myself." Ethan nodded, slowly, as if he understood the gravity of those words. It wasn't just an admission, it was a commitment to something new. When he left, he didn't say much more. But the quiet between us now felt like a bridge, not a barrier. It was something I could walk across, slowly, when I was ready. Samantha didn't come by. She didn't send a message, but I didn't expect it. Not yet. The healing had begun, quietly, without fanfare. But it had begun. The lawyer's office smelled of paper and leather, cool and detached, a far cry from the warmth of my apartment. I walked in with Alan by my side, both of us silent as we made our way to the sleek glass conference table. The air was thick with the weight of decisions I had never imagined making. Alan settled into the chair beside me, his calm demeanor easing some of the tension that had settled in my chest. "You sure about this?" he asked softly, his gaze catching mine for a moment. I nodded, my fingers lightly tapping the edge of the table, the pen in my hand already feeling like a lifeline. "It's the right thing to do," I said quietly, but with certainty. The right thing for them, the right thing for me. We'd arrived a few minutes early, giving me a few moments to gather my thoughts. This wasn't a decision made in haste. It had taken time, a quiet realization that my choices didn't need to serve the past. They needed to serve the future. The attorney arrived, his presence as expected, efficient, detached. He went over the papers with a practiced ease, but his words barely registered. My mind was somewhere else, picturing Tommy's future, his potential. What I had learned in the last few months, that there were things more important than legacy, more important than holding on to material wealth. What mattered was what I could give forward. The attorney paused, as if waiting for my signature, his eyes flickering to the document in front of me. "So, the penthouse," he said, lifting the page slightly. "Your estate will transfer the property to Tommy's education trust and to the housing scholarship fund?" "Yes," I replied, my voice firm, steady. "The penthouse is going to serve a purpose. It's not about keeping it in the family, it's about giving back." He nodded and slid the papers toward me. Alan watched silently, his gaze heavy with understanding. I picked up the pen and hesitated for just a moment, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Ethan, Samantha. They had never understood the decisions I made. They had never understood the quiet work behind everything I had built. But this wasn't about them. It wasn't about keeping them satisfied or letting them claim their part of the story. This was about ensuring that the legacy I left was one of purpose, one that would matter in a way that would ripple through time, even if they didn't see it. I signed the papers. Each stroke of the pen felt like an unburdening, the past finally being put to rest, the future taking its place. Alan smiled at me, a quiet approval in his eyes. Not leaving anything to Ethan? I didn't look up, but the question lingered. I already gave him the headline, I said softly. The rest belongs to the future. My words felt like an affirmation, a quiet truth I'd known for some time. Alan leaned back, nodding slowly. That's legacy, not revenge. I glanced at him, feeling the weight of that truth. They're often the same thing, if done right. I signed the final page, my hand steady. As the papers slid into the folder, I felt a deep peace settle over me. The decision had been made, and it wasn't about punishing anyone. It wasn't about revenge or victory. It was about something more profound. Letting go. Allowing others the space to grow, to learn, and to find their own way. There was no part of me that felt regret or loss. The penthouse would go to Tommy's trust, to the next generation who had no stake in the past. It would provide for a future of opportunity, just as I had hoped for Ethan and Samantha when they were young. The world I had worked to build, the one they never quite understood, was finally, quietly, complete. Alan stood, offering me a hand as I gathered the papers. His smile was small, understanding. You did the right thing, he said. I took his hand, feeling the weight of everything that had been said, unsaid. I think I finally am. Later that night, I stood in front of the window in the penthouse. The city sprawled before me like an endless sea of lights. The skyline glittered, beautiful and untouched. The view, once so daunting, now felt like a promise, one I had earned, not by holding on to things, but by letting go. For the first time, the weight of my choices didn't feel like a burden. It felt like freedom. There was peace in the decision I had made. Ethan, Samantha, they didn't need to understand. They didn't need to know what I had done. I knew, and that was enough. As I looked out at the city, the world continued on below me, unaware of the small shift I had made in the quiet of this room. But it didn't matter. The world would figure it out in time. For now, I was content. And as the last light of the day disappeared behind the horizon, I smiled quietly, at peace with what I had done. The knock on the door came early, too early for a casual visit. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping tea and staring at the city below. The day still hesitant to begin. It wasn't a guest I was expecting, but I knew who it was as soon as I heard the sound of it. A hesitant, almost apologetic knock. I stood up, smoothing my sweater, and opened the door to find Ethan standing there, his face drawn, holding a small bouquet of flowers. The gesture was so simple, but it hit me harder than I'd expected. I brought you some flowers, he said, his voice uncertain, as though he didn't know what to say next, but he knew he had to say something. I looked at the flowers, then back at him. His posture was stiff. The same man who had stormed into my life with accusations and pride now standing in front of me, almost fragile. You didn't have to do that, I said softly, stepping aside to let him in. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze shifting from the flowers to me. He held them out awkwardly, as if not sure how to offer them or what to expect in return. I'm sorry, Mom, he said, finally, his words coming out in a rush. For everything. For making you feel like you weren't enough. For confusing pride with love. He looked down at the bouquet as if trying to ground himself in something. I didn't immediately respond, didn't know what to say. There was a quiet vulnerability in him that had never been there before. The years of tension, of built-up anger had melted away in an instant, replaced with something else. Remorse, understanding, maybe even a bit of guilt. I took the flowers from his hands, my fingers brushing against his. "For what?" I asked quietly, my voice steady but not unkind. "For not giving me credit? For not seeing me?" I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Tired of the games. Tired of the pretenses. He looked up at me then, his eyes raw. For confusing what I thought was love with something that was just pride. "I've always been proud of you, but I never showed it. I just assumed you'd always be there to clean up my mess. I didn't realize you were carrying your own." The words hit harder than I expected. I hadn't realized how much I had needed to hear them. I hadn't realized how much I had longed for this moment, this truth. "I think we both spent too long pretending, Ethan," I said softly. "You pretending that everything was mine to fix, and me pretending that I didn't want you to see the weight of it all. But that's over now." He nodded, his lips pressing together as if he were trying to hold back something else, something even more difficult to say. He didn't speak for a long moment, the silence stretching between us. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "Can I give you a hug?" I looked at him, searching his face for the remnants of the son I'd raised, the son who had once been so full of confidence and pride. And there, beneath the weight of everything that had happened, I saw him. The boy who had always wanted to make me proud, but had never understood how. I nodded and stepped forward, wrapping my arms around him. For the first time in years, it felt like I was holding the son I had always wanted to reach, the one who had always been just out of my grasp. It wasn't a perfect hug. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was real. It was what we both needed. When I pulled away, I saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the regret, and something else, understanding. There was no more arrogance, no more deflection, just a man, finally seeing me for who I was. "I've always loved you, Mom," he said quietly, his voice rough. "I just didn't know how to show it." I smiled at him, feeling something inside me soften. "I know, Ethan. I know." It wasn't forgiveness I was offering him. It was the simple truth that I had always loved him too, even when he couldn't see me, even when he couldn't understand. As he turned to leave, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. The past wasn't fixed. It never would be. But the future was wide open, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could step into it without fear. The door clicked shut behind Ethan, and I returned to the window, my gaze drifting over the city again. It was Tommy who pulled me back to the moment, as he always did. A small envelope had been slipped through the mail slot earlier, and now, as I opened it, I found a drawing. It was a picture of the penthouse, the big windows, the skyline stretching out beyond it. But more than that, it was Tommy's joy captured in simple lines. A child's view of the world, free from the burden of our family's history. I walked to the frame I'd kept for special things, and I carefully placed his drawing inside. There, next to the window, where it would always be visible. Samantha hadn't come. She hadn't called. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The silence between us was something we would have to bridge. But Tommy's drawing was a promise of the future, one not tainted by the mistakes of the past. I stood there for a while, looking at the drawing, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, and everything that would come. The sunlight filled the penthouse that morning, spilling across the floor like liquid gold, casting long shadows over the sleek furniture. It had become a familiar ritual, the first light of day breaking through the windows, the city stretching out below, the skyline cutting through the soft haze of early morning. I stood by the window, watching the quiet bustle of Chicago waking up, feeling the rhythm of the city pulse beneath me. The skyline was as magnificent as ever, but today, it didn't just belong to the city. It belonged to me, too. I wasn't just a part of it anymore. I was one with it. My reflection blended with the city in the glass. A quiet acknowledgement of what I had built and what I had become. Grace arrived a few moments later, as she always did, unannounced, but always at the right time. She entered through the door, her presence familiar and comforting. "Morning, Maggie," she said, her voice light but laced with something more. "I saw the headlines today. They're saying the penthouse owner turned down a 6 months offer." I turned toward her, a small smile tugging at the corners of my lips. "Because peace isn't for sale," I replied, my voice calm but firm. There was no drama in it, no theatrical flourish. It was just the truth. She nodded, stepping toward the window beside me, looking out at the view I had come to love so much. "I guess that's what they don't understand. They can offer you everything they think you want, but they'll never be able to buy what you have now." "No," I agreed, "and that's what makes it so valuable. What I've built here, it's not for sale." We stood in silence for a moment, each of us lost in our thoughts, the city below continuing on with its unceasing rhythm. But in that silence, something deep and unspoken passed between us. Grace had always known me, but now she understood me in a way that no one else could. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of it all finally settle into place. The decisions I had made, the choices I had carried for so long, they had all led me to this point, and I was at peace with it, with me. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the soft buzz of my phone on the counter. I walked over, my steps slow, as if the world outside could wait a little longer. It was a message from Ethan. His words appeared on the screen, simple but weighty. "I finally get it. You didn't act rich. You acted free." I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a wave of something wash over me. Relief? Recognition? Maybe both. Grace glanced at me from across the room, sensing the change in the air. She knew the significance of those words. Ethan had seen me, truly seen me, for the first time. "I think he's starting to understand," I said quietly, more to myself than to Grace. Grace smiled softly, but there was no surprise in her eyes. "It was always about freedom, Maggie. He just had to see it for himself." I looked out at the skyline again, at the city that had once seemed so distant and untouchable. It no longer felt like a symbol of ambition or competition. It felt like home. Not the walls, not the luxury, but the understanding that I had carved out a space for myself in it, on my terms. Ethan's message had hit deeper than I expected. He wasn't just apologizing. He was recognizing something about me, about the quiet strength that had carried me all these years, the resilience that wasn't born of wealth or status, but of survival. "Free," I whispered under my breath. That was it. Not acting rich, not living to prove anything, just living, finally, without the weight of pride or expectation. I looked at Grace again, feeling a warmth in my chest that hadn't been there before. "I wasn't acting rich," I said, my voice steady. "I was simply done living poor in spirit." She nodded, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "You always were rich, Maggie, just not in the way they understood." I smiled, and for the first time in years, it wasn't an effort. It was natural, genuine. The sunlight shifted in the room, casting a soft glow over everything. And I realized that the city I had once thought I had to conquer had already welcomed me in. It wasn't about ownership anymore, it was about belonging. And in that moment, I finally belonged to myself, to this life I had quietly built step by step without needing anyone's approval. The world could keep spinning. They could keep guessing, keep asking. But I had found what I needed: peace, freedom. And as the last light of the day dipped below the horizon, painting the city in soft hues of gold, I knew it. For the first time in my life, I was untouchable.